Hey, everybody. Sorry I was unable to be here today, but I wanted to make sure to go over some of the chronology of the Civil War and to focus on the nature and practices of the war itself. If you remember, we had left off after the White Terror when Mao Zedong's and the CCP had retreated to the Jiangxi and created the Jiangxi Soviet. And if you remember, during that time period, within a few years, they had gained support of most of the peasants living under their rule, largely because of the land law, if you remember, where they had divided up the cultivated land, but also doing things such as setting up schools, abolishing outmoded practices such as arranged marriages and foot binding, and creating even peasant councils that allowed communities say in the running of their affairs. Um, we had finished last class with the Red Army's rules of discipline. And this treatment by the CCP really helped to gain support from the peasantry. So today, what I want to focus on and our objectives are to, number one, explain the key events that further divided the country during the early Civil War, the first Civil War, and the reasons that a united front was finally able to be established and the effects of the Japanese invasion of Manchuria and China. And so I want to start off with the extermination campaigns. And Chiang Kai-shek regarded the Jiangxi Soviet as a greater threat to his authority than either the warlords, than the warlord period. And he therefore organized a series of extermination campaigns against the communists in an attempt to wipe them out. And between 1930 and 1934, he mounted 5 extermination campaigns, each one bigger than the last. And with that, the Chiang's armies were always outnumbered by the communists. I'm so sorry. The communists were outnumbered by Chiang's armies, but the first 4 campaigns were still total failures. Mao Zedong and leader of the army, Zhu Dai, used clever tactics to keep them. Instead of fighting head-on in pitched battles, they had lured the Kuomintang armies deep into communist-held territory. Think about World War II, how the Soviets pulled in the German soldiers only to have the winter and the scorched earth policy without those supplies, the Napoleonic Wars as well. And in many respects, the Kuomintang armies were, deep into communist-held territory, and they knocked out. The 5th campaign was the biggest campaign, of course. And one of the things that, I'm so sorry, I got to go back a second, but one of the things that also helped the communists, the CCP, was Mao's combat slogans and the 4 rules of combat. And so the first one, when the enemy advances, we retreat. Again, think of scorched earth policy, right? Second one, when the enemy halts and encamps, then we trouble them, right? And not necessarily direct on, but more like ambushes and so forth. When the enemy seeks to avoid battles, we attack, right? That'd be the thing. When they don't want to fight, let's fight. And then fourth, if they retreat, we pursue. And like I said, those first 4 campaigns were great successes for the CCP. The 5th campaign, however, is going to change that. The 5th campaign, launched by Chiang Kai-shek, was influenced by German tactics. And this was the biggest extermination campaign. He used a new method of attack, worked out by his military advisor, Hans von Seeckt. And instead of invading the red areas and trying to capture them by fighting battles, the methods were to surround the Jiangxi Soviet, in a way to siege them with 500,000 troops and then advance very slowly, building concrete shelters called blockhouses, digging trenches, putting up barbed wire fences, and so forth as they went. And his aim was to stop all movement into and out of the Soviet, starving the communists of food, fuel, weapons, and ammunition, and slowly reducing the area they controlled. Seeckt's blockhouse strategy was very successful, a major success. And by October 1934, the communists had lost over half their territory, and 60,000 soldiers in the Red Army had been killed. The area under their control was steadily shrinking as the Kuomintang advanced. Excuse me for just one moment, and I will be momentarily back. Again, to repeat, the communists had survived those first four extermination campaigns by luring Kuomintang units into their territory and smashing them in those attacks. But again, this fifth campaign was suggested, they adopted different tactics combined with the new tactics of the nationalists. And these new tactics were suggested by a Russian agent named Otto Braun. Braun insisted that Mao Zedong's tactics were politically wrong and that the Red Army should not retreat and allow peasants to be captured and killed by the Kuomintang. Instead, the Red Army should defend the borders by fighting head-on battles with the Kuomintang. So those four combat slogans of Mao's were no longer in effect. And backed by 24 Russian-trained leaders of the Jiangxi Soviet, or 28 leaders, thus they're called the 28 Bolshevik period of this time period, Mao was actually briefly expelled from the party's Central Committee. And under Brown's leadership, the Red Army now began to defend its territory in pitched battles, but at great cost. It was a disaster for the CCP. And in fact, in one battle alone, the Red Army lost 8,000 men, the Battle of Guancheng. And the Kuomintang blockhouse rings easily cut them off from the rest of China. They couldn't replace the men. They couldn't replace their weapons. They couldn't get supplies. And by the summer of 1934, the Red Army was caged in Jiangxi, surrounded by 4 lines of blockhouses. And Mao suggested the Red Army should try to break through these lines to attack the Kuomintang, but Brown and the Russian-trained, the 28 Bolsheviks, basically rejected Mao's advice. They planned to retreat. And the Red Army would try to break through the blockhouse lines and head for another communist base where another group was at. And this retreat, many of the Red Army commanders had blamed Brown for these losses, and part of it was the amount of equipment which slowed them down. Brown had been leading the Red Army in a straight line, making it easy for the Kuomintang to predict their movements. And so eventually, the leaders of the Communist Party met in Zunyi in January 1935, and they held a meeting to work out better tactics. And Brown was suspended, and military control of the Red Army was given back to Mao Zedong and Zhu Dai. And back with the leadership of Mao and Zhu Dai, the Red Army now took a new direction, twisting and turning, splitting into groups, reforming. It went south through a remote province called Yunnan, across the river, and the new destination was Shaanxi province in northern China. Another Soviet to take control in that Yunnan district there. And the Red Army trekked north, became known as the Long March, 1934. It, essentially faced great obstacles. 1935 faced great obstacles, carried out many daring acts. I think I spoke to you guys in class. One of the most famous was crossing the Dadu River, where 22 soldiers swung across the river on chains. That was all that was left of the suspension bridge across it while under enemy fire. But by doing this, they were able to get the rest of the Red Army to cross over the river. But the Long March, it had its toll. It went over snowy mountains, among some of the highest. Let me go through this here. Catch up. Snowy mountains, some of the snowy mountains among the highest in the world, the Himalayans, I'm sorry. Also across the treacherous grasslands where hundreds of men drowned in deep marshes. They were continuously harassed and chased by the Kuomintang and local warlords, as well as by hostile non-Chinese tribesmen. And it came to an end by October, but fewer than 10,000 of those who set out actually marched into Yunnan. Over almost a year of marching, hunger, enemy attacks, disease, exposure, accidents, desertion had seen to the rest. And, with that, they had to basically rebuild. Interestingly, they were able to restore their strength as well by October 1935 and make it a viable fighting force with that. In addition, I want to talk about the Japanese invasion of Manchuria here a little bit, and this will be something that can also help you for paper 1. As you already know, Japan invaded Manchuria, renamed it Manchukuo, made it a puppet state of the Japanese Empire. And the Japanese army, also called the Kwantung Army, occupied other provinces in Manchuria and outside and continued to advance slowly southwards. And it had occupied some additional provinces in northern China, that, basically was demanding the separation of those northern China provinces from the southern part, and the Japanese trying to get them to join with Manchuria. And, of course, there was already long-standing anti-foreign feelings in China. We discussed that the other day. And now these long-standing anti-foreign feelings were very much directed against the Japanese. In Shanghai, for example, China's busiest port, Chinese people organized boycotts against Japanese goods. And many Chinese wanted Chiang Kai-shek to confront the Kuomintang or Japanese army, but Chiang Kai-shek did not agree. He believed first they had to get national unity, and in order to do that, he had to wipe out the CCP before risking a war with Japan, despite the Japanese aggression. Again, in many ways, this was Chiang Kai-shek's war to lose. The Red Army, CCP, for their part, wanted to fight Japan. In fact, they said that all Chinese people should unite to defend the nation, and their motto is Chinese do not fight Chinese. The Long March had also brought them closer to the areas most threatened by Japan. And so again, they're building up support from the people, and they're in a good position to make war against Japan. As I said earlier, Chiang Kai-shek, for the most part, I'm back with that. The source here just talks about the boycott. And it was an American journalist in Shanghai that really discussed the fact that they had just basically Japanese commodities had piled up on the shore. And so I'm going to give you about 1 minute to read, 30 seconds to read this, and then I'll move on. So as I said, Chiang Kai-shek ignored the demands of the Communists for United Front. He ignored the motto of Chinese don't fight Chinese, do not fight Chinese. And he orders yet another extermination campaign against the communists in 1936. He sends his army to attack their base in Yan'an, which again, in that area, that's Shaanxi province. And the base for this campaign was the city of Xi'an, Xian. And what he does with this, I'm going to go back here and explain it for a second. His orders were to wipe out the Yan'an Soviet. He used bomber aircraft, tanks, armored cars, and even poison gas were all made available for his use. The problem was that, and he sent his army, was commanded by, a guy named Zhang Zuoling was the leader of the Nationalist Army. And his troops, though, were mostly Manchurians. And these troops really were more itching to fight the Japanese than they were to fight the communists. Zhang himself wanted revenge against the Japanese. They had murdered his father. And so in 1936, well, Zhang is, he's been sent there to fight the communists. He and the communists, the CCP, make an unofficial agreement not to fight each other. They agreed instead to concentrate their energies on attacking the Japanese. And in December 1936, Chiang Kai-shek learned what was happening, and he flew to Xi'an to persuade Zhang to renew the extermination campaign. And what happens in Xi'an is shortly after Chiang's arrival, Zhang takes him as prisoner. And in the early morning of December 12th, 200 of Zhang's troops stormed the hotel in which Chiang was staying. Chiang managed to escape, but was soon caught hiding among the rocks in the hillside behind the hotel. And Zhang's rebels held him prisoner for the next 2 weeks. And during that time, they held discussions with representatives of the GMD, as well as the CCP, as well as the Russian government. And in the end, they agreed to release Chiang, but only in return for his support to form a united front with the communists against Japan. The Russian government agreed to give them military aid, and Chiang was named commander-in-chief of all Chinese forces. And he was only released, like I said again, after committing to this. And quite honestly, this agreement to form a united front. Oh, this is actually, I'm so sorry, I think this is kind of interesting. This is Captain Sun Mingzhu, and it's an account of what happened in Xi'an. And so I will give you another minute or so to read this, and then we'll move on. All right. So again, as you look at this, this is, shown in a way, um, this idea that the CCP was really willing to make up and to do this. And like I said, eventually, um, it was agreed. And, Japan in 1937, of course, invades coastal China. And without declaring war, they begin this other invasion in July of that year, trying to conquer the entire country. Japanese troops provoked local Chinese troops into a fight on the Marco Polo Bridge outside of Beijing. That's something important to know about World War for Paper One, the Marco Polo Bridge attack. In many respects, it's kind of the starting point of the war in Asia. And they claimed that the Chinese had fired on them. But the Japanese launched an attack on army bases around Beijing and then occupied the city itself. It had been carefully prepared and was quickly followed by a full-scale invasion of China. Japanese troops pushed southward afterwards, pushing back Kuomintang troops everywhere. And after a 3-month siege and heavy aerial bombing, they captured Shanghai by November. So within a 4-month period, they captured China's two largest cities, Beijing and Shanghai. They also captured Nanjing, which was the capital at the time, and Chiang Kai-shek was forced to retreat to Sichuan province and set up a new wartime capital. And by 1938, around 1 million Japanese troops were in China. They had control of the main cities. They had control of the lines of communication. They had control of the provinces around the mouth of the Yangtze River, the most densely populated area. And later that year, they captured several other important cities, including Wuhan and Guangzhou as well. That is it for today. I just wanted to kind of go over these notes with you. You can, of course, go back and watch the recording, and that's it. And I will see you next Thursday in class.